Hi, this is Mahavan Das. Welcome to Simple Gita, Chapter 5. This chapter is entitled Karma Yoga, Action in Krishna Consciousness. Let's take a look at the connection between it and the previous chapter. In explaining transcendental knowledge to Arjuna in Chapter 4, Krishna glorified both knowledge and giving up action, but in the final text of the chapter still instructed him to fight or act. Therefore, Chapter 5 opens with Arjuna asking Krishna a question which is similar to the one he asked at the beginning of Chapter 3. Which is better, action or giving up action? Here's our overview of Chapter 5. In this chapter, Arjuna again asks Krishna about the apparent contradiction between action and renunciation of action. And Krishna will answer this question explaining that action and renunciation are not opposites, but should be integrated in the form of karma yoga, in which one acts on the platform of knowledge and therefore gives up the results of one's actions for the pleasure of the Supreme. Thus, he will explain karma yoga in greater depth than he did in Chapter 3. Let's take a look at the first verse and purport for this chapter from Bhagavad Gita as it is. Arjuna said, O Krishna, first of all you ask me to renounce work, and then again you recommend work with devotion. Now will you kindly tell me definitely which of the two is more beneficial? Srila Prabhupada's purport. In this 5th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says that work and devotional service is better than dry mental speculation. Devotional service is easier than the latter because, being transcendental in nature, it frees one from reaction. In the 2nd chapter, preliminary knowledge of the soul and its entanglement in the material body were explained. How to get out of this material encagement by buddhi yoga or devotional service was also explained therein. In the 3rd chapter, it was explained that a person who is situated on the platform of knowledge no longer has any duties to perform. And in the 4th chapter, the Lord told Arjuna that all kinds of sacrificial work culminate in knowledge. However, at the end of the 4th chapter, the Lord advised Arjuna to wake up and fight, being situated in perfect knowledge. Therefore, by simultaneously stressing the importance of both work and devotion and inaction and knowledge, Krishna has perplexed Arjuna and confused his determination. Arjuna understands that renunciation and knowledge involves cessation of all kinds of work performed as sense activities. But if one performs work in devotional service, then how is work stopped? In other words, he thinks that sannyasa or renunciation and knowledge should be altogether free from all kinds of activity, because work and renunciation appear to him to be incompatible. He appears not to have understood that work in full knowledge is non-reactive, and is therefore the same as inaction. He inquires, therefore, whether he should cease work altogether or work in full knowledge. Let's go over the key points here in Chapter 5. The first key point is Arjuna's question. Which is better, renunciation of action or acting in devotion? And the next key point is Krishna's answer, that working in devotion is equal to, but actually better than, the renunciation of action. He explains that essentially renunciation of action and acting in devotion are the same because they have the same goal, which is liberation, freedom from the cycle of birth and death. But acting in the spirit of renunciation, or in other words, acting in devotion, is better because it's easier to perform, and therefore it entails much less risk in terms of failing. This is because it's an active process, and therefore it's much more natural, and therefore it's also a much more joyful process. Krishna explains that simply trying to give up all action does not automatically equal happiness, but acting for the pleasure of the Supreme, or acting for Krishna's pleasure, connects one to him, to he who is the reservoir of all pleasure. So that is the actual meaning of the term yoga. Yoga means to connect. Who are we trying to connect to? We're trying to connect to the Supreme, who is the reservoir of all pleasure. So by acting in devotion, that connection is naturally and joyfully established. The next key point we get here is performing karma yoga frees one from karmic reactions. We first hear about the characteristics of one acting in karma yoga. Such a person is self-controlled. They work for the Supreme with detachment from the results of their activities. And they're always seeking purification of consciousness, which makes them peaceful. We also get in this next section knowledge of the three doers of action and their relationship. This is an interesting philosophical question. Who is actually doing things here in the material world? Basically, there are three doers in this world. The first one is nature. We will hear this again in the 13th chapter, and we also heard it in the 3rd chapter, that nature, in terms of its three modes, is actually doing everything in the material world. In other words, nature, or our particular body, is a doer by action. The body is doing everything in this world. So nature in that way is a doer. The next doer is the soul. Now the soul doesn't actually do anything. As we've heard in the 3rd chapter, it's nature that's doing everything in this world in terms of physical actions. But still, the soul is a doer by desire. Because the soul desires to do things in this world, therefore the soul is also a doer. And actually desire is a subtle form of action. So by desire, the soul is also a doer. And finally there's the supersoul, who is also a doer. How is it that the supersoul is a doer? As we will hear again in the 13th chapter, the supersoul is a doer by being a sanctioner of all activities. It's explained there in the 13th chapter that the supersoul is the witness of all the desires of the individual soul and the sanctioner of those desires. So in that sense, the supersoul is also a doer, because without the sanction of the supersoul, the desires of the individual soul cannot be actioned by material nature or by the body. Now Krishna explains here that ignorance of these three doers and their relationship binds the soul to the cycle of repeated birth and death. But knowledge of this relationship between these three doers produces enlightenment. He said, just as the sun lights up everything in the daytime, similarly this knowledge of the three doers and their relationship allows us to see what's really going on. And when we can see what's really going on, then we act on the spiritual platform for the pleasure of the Supreme, and there's no reaction, no material reaction to those actions, no karma. So we accrue karma in this world when we identify with our body, when we think, I am my body, and we take all credit for what the body does. That's why we get karma. That's why we get karmic reactions. That's why we stay in this material world, taking birth after birth, taking body after body in the cycle of samsara. So when the enlightened soul understands that he's not the body, but a spiritual entity who is dependent ultimately on the supersoul, then the enlightened soul, in knowledge of his relationship with the supersoul as a dependent part, performs all actions for the pleasure of the supersoul, and in this way is freed from all karma. And the final section of this chapter, the key point is liberation by focusing on the Supreme. Krishna says, when one's intelligence, mind, faith, and refuge are all fixed in the Supreme, Then one becomes fully cleansed of misgivings through complete knowledge, and thus proceeds straight on the path of liberation. So this is the basic principle of the yoga system and of spiritual progress in general, to focus the mind on the Supreme. This is the real definition of meditation, and we'll hear more details of this process of meditation in the next chapter, Dhyana Yoga, which is the yoga of dhyana or meditation. So here in this chapter we get the principle that to focus on the Supreme, to focus our mind on the Supreme, that is the basic principle of liberation. Because by that focus, one becomes cleansed of misgivings. One's consciousness becomes purified, and one can actually see the way forward. Krishna also explains in this section that a truly liberated person, someone who has cleansed their mind of all misgivings, is in constant meditation on the Supreme, and therefore has equal vision of every being. That's because they see the Supreme as the Supersoul in the heart of every living entity. Krishna says here, the humble sages, by virtue of true knowledge, see with equal vision a learned and gentle Brahmana, a cow, an elephant, a dog, and a dog-eater. Srila Prabhupada explains here in his purport, a Krishna-conscious person does not make any distinction between species or castes. The Brahmana, so a Brahmana is a spiritual intellectual or spiritual teacher in the yoga culture. So Prabhupada says, the Brahmana and the outcast may be different from the social point of view, or a dog, a cow, and an elephant may be different from the point of view of species. But these differences of body are meaningless from the viewpoint of a learned transcendentalist. This is due to their relationship to the Supreme, for the Supreme Lord, by his plenary portion as Paramatma, is present in everyone's heart. Such an understanding of the Supreme is real knowledge. The Lord as Paramatma is present both in the outcast and in the Brahmana, although the body of a Brahmana and that of an outcast are not the same. The bodies are material productions of different modes of material nature, but the soul and the supersoul within the body are of the same spiritual quality. The similarity in the quality of the soul and the supersoul, however, does not make them equal in quantity. For the individual soul is present only in that particular body, whereas the Paramatma is present in each and every body. A Krishna-conscious person has full knowledge of this, and therefore he is truly learned and has equal vision. The similar characteristics of the soul and the supersoul are that they are both conscious, eternal, and blissful. But the difference is that the individual soul is conscious within the limited jurisdiction of the body, whereas the supersoul is conscious of all bodies. The supersoul is present in all bodies without distinction. So bodies may be different, but because the souls within those bodies all have an eternal relationship with the supersoul, who's present, as Srila Prabhupada said in the purport, in all bodies without distinction, the liberated person sees all beings equally, regardless of their material body or temporary material covering. So this is the way to achieve true equality in the world, the true equal vision, to see beyond the material coverings to the spiritual nature of every living entity, to see their eternal connection to the Supreme. The next point Krishna makes in this section is that sense enjoyment is the cause of suffering. Now, that can be a hard thing to understand, because when our senses contact an enjoyable sense object or objects, we generally think that's happiness. Our senses get a good feeling, or our mind gets a good feeling, and we think, I'm happy. So how is it then this that this contact between the senses and the sense objects is a cause of suffering. Krishna explains it's because the contact between the senses and the sense objects is temporary. And so if we don't have the object of our desire, we suffer because we hanker for something we don't have. And if we've lost something that we had that we enjoyed, a particular object of enjoyment, we then lament. We suffer that way by feeling sorry that we've lost what we had. So this could be a possession, it could be a position, it could be a job, it could be a relationship, it could be a place of residence, any material thing that we become attached to. So in other words, the happiness of sense enjoyment is only in the moment that our senses contact the object of enjoyment. But because that contact is temporary, either before the contact or after the contact, therefore that contact, although containing some resemblance of happiness, is actually a cause of suffering. A deeper reason for this is also that because we become attached to this process of connecting our senses with sense objects, we get karma. And that karma causes another material body in the next life. And along with that material body comes so many sufferings. Birth, death, old age, disease, etc. So in this way, Krishna is trying to get us to see beyond the superficial presentation of sense enjoyment to the actual reality of contact between our senses and apparently pleasing sense objects. Therefore, Krishna says, before giving up this present body, if one is able to tolerate the urges of the material senses and check the force of desire and anger, he is well situated and is happy in this world. So how is this possible, to tolerate the urges of the material senses? Because one may theoretically know these things. Sense enjoyment, it's a cause of suffering. But still the material senses push for temporary enjoyment. How does one tolerate that? How does one check the force of desire and anger and become well situated and happy in this world? Krishna explains it's possible by a higher experience of inner happiness that comes from genuine yoga or connection to the Supreme, who, as we were explaining, is the source of all pleasure. By that higher experience of pleasure, one can easily tolerate the pushings of the senses, the urges of the lower self. In the next section, we hear some practices for assisting us in focusing our mind on the Supreme. We hear about the necessity of a purified lifestyle. That means a lifestyle which is molded with enlightenment as the purpose. We hear that we need the desire to seek happiness within as opposed to without, and a desire to control the mind. We hear that working for the true welfare of others is also a very favourable practice for assisting us in focusing on the Supreme. And we hear that sincere endeavour for spiritual advancement with self-discipline is also very helpful and necessary. Self-discipline, of course, is necessary in any worthwhile endeavour, even an ordinary endeavour in this world. So what to speak of the highest endeavour of striving for liberation, striving for self-realization, for enlightenment. Certainly self-discipline is also required. Towards the end of the chapter, we hear in brief about how to attain perfection through Ashtanga Yoga, which is the yoga of 8 limbs. And we will hear that elaborated on in the next chapter. And finally, Krishna explains the peace formula. Wouldn't we all like to hear the peace formula from Krishna? He explains that Krishna consciousness means understanding 3 things. And when one understands these 3 things, he or she attains true peace. which is the foundation for genuine happiness. As he explained in the second chapter, how can there be any happiness without peace? So let's hear those three components of the peace formula. Krishna says, a person in full consciousness of me, knowing me to be, 1, the ultimate beneficiary of all sacrifices and austerities, 2, the supreme lord of all planets and demigods, and 3, the benefactor and well-wisher of all living entities, attains peace from the pangs of material miseries. So, the peace formula here is stated to have 3 components. Number 1, Krishna is the supreme enjoyer. Number 2, he's the supreme proprietor. That's why he's the supreme enjoyer, because everything is his to enjoy. And number 3, he is the benefactor and well-wisher of all living entities. He's the real friend of all living beings, being their ultimate source. Let's hear Srila Prabhupada's purport here. He says, the conditioned souls within the clutches of illusory energy are all anxious to attain peace in the material world, but they do not know the formula for peace, which is explained in this part of the Bhagavad Gita. The greatest peace formula is simply this. Lord Krishna is the beneficiary of all human activities. Men should offer everything to the transcendental service of the Lord, because he is the proprietor of all planets and the demigods thereon. Under the spell of illusion, living entities are trying to be lords of all they survey, but actually they are dominated by the material energy of the Lord. The Lord is the master of material nature, and the conditioned souls are under the stringent rules of material nature. Unless one understands these bare facts, it is not possible to achieve peace in the world, either individually or collectively. This is the sense of Krishna consciousness. Lord Krishna is the supreme predominator, and all living entities, including the great demigods, are his subordinates. One can attain perfect peace only in complete Krishna consciousness. So when we understand these 3 things, that Krishna is the supreme enjoyer, the supreme proprietor, and the supreme friend, we can then mold a lifestyle based around that reality and actually become truly peaceful, because we're actually living in harmony with the ultimate reality. Okay, let's summarize chapter 5. In this chapter, we see a lot of similarities to chapter 3, but with more depth. We hear again about the principle of renunciation of action, a big point for Arjuna and for any spiritual practitioner. The conclusion here is that we don't renounce or give up action, but we renounce the materialistic consciousness in which we perform action, and therefore we give up the results of our actions to the Supreme. Thus, action in knowledge or karma yoga, action for the pleasure of Krishna, is what Krishna recommends. This action accrues no karmic reaction. Therefore, it's equal to inaction. By performing karma yoga, one is more naturally situated than by trying to give up all action, is happier, and therefore it has less risk of falling from the path. We've heard how karma yoga, or action and knowledge, frees one from karmic reactions, that a liberated person has equal vision due to seeing the Supreme in every being, and also how sense enjoyment is the cause of suffering. Therefore, the yogi must transfer his pleasure-seeking capacity from matter to spirit, while tolerating the urges of the senses in the process of doing so. This is possible by the higher taste of happiness produced by yoga, or genuine connection to the Supreme, who is the source of all pleasure. We've heard practices for focusing the mind on the Supreme, a purified lifestyle, the desire to seek happiness within and control the mind, working for the true welfare of others, sincere endeavour for spiritual advancement with self-discipline, and finally, the peace formula. So to conclude the class, I'd like to read from Srila Prabhupada's final purport in this chapter. He says, this 5th chapter is a practical explanation of Krishna consciousness, generally known as karma yoga. To work in Krishna consciousness is to work with the complete knowledge of the Lord as the predominator. Such work is not different from transcendental knowledge. The eightfold yoga mysticism is automatically practiced in Krishna consciousness because the ultimate purpose is served. There is a gradual process of elevation in the practice of yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. So those are the 8 limbs of the 8-limbed yoga system. But these only preface perfection by devotional service, which alone can award peace to the human being. It is the highest perfection of life. Let's preview Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is entitled Dhyana Yoga. In Chapter 5, Krishna explained at length how to attain liberation by karma yoga, or action in Krishna consciousness, and also briefly by Ashtanga yoga at the end of the chapter. In Chapter 6, he explains Ashtanga yoga in more detail. Thanks so much for joining me in the class today on Chapter 5, Karma Yoga, Action in Krishna Consciousness, and I hope I can get your good company for the next class on Chapter 6, Dhyana Yoga.